Did you feel this sense of fatigue from war?
Not really, actually. It's very clear to me that Ukraine is under pressure, but it's not nearly as bad.
If you were to describe Russia's and Ukrainian strategies briefly, how would you describe it?
We have seen the peak of Russian strength, and from here it's going to be a gradual decline. And I don't think either side is close to losing at this point. It's still two very equal armies fighting this out on the front line.
Will there be some sort of alliance inside Europe? How viable will it be?
The only way that Europe can do this is together with Ukraine. I think we see Denmark trying to take the lead, and even though we are a small country we don't have that many resources, we can set an example.
If we got all we asked for in the beginning, plus the sanctions, the war would be over?
Yes.
Hi everyone, my name is Zhenya Melnik and this is United 24 Media, and next to me is Anders Puck Nielsen, who's a Danish military expert and maritime strategist. He's a researcher at Royal Danish Defense College, and he specializes obviously in maritime strategy, Russian military strategy and European defense. So we're gonna touch all these topics in the context of Ukraine. Anders, welcome. I'm very glad to have you here.
Well, thanks for the invitation to come.
Let's start from the beginning, I guess. How was your experience in Kyiv? I know it's your first time, so did it match your expectations? How was it for you?
Yeah, it's the first time since the invasion.
Mm-hmm.
So it's been great being here. It's, you know, when you are in Denmark, you get this impression that war is everywhere, and then you come to this vibrant city where, you know, it's so beautiful and people are so friendly and good restaurants and everything. So it's kind of, and then of course you have the air raid alerts and those things. And once you get to talk with people, it's clear that there is a war going on. Everyone, you know, is influenced by this. But at the same time, the contrast to the image I think most people in the West have about what it's like in Ukraine is very big.
Did you feel this sense of fatigue from war?
Not really, actually. I mean, it's very clear to me that Ukraine is under pressure, but it's not nearly as bad as the impression you will get if you follow some of the Western media and some of the narrative in the West that this is unsustainable. And unfortunately, right now, if you follow the messaging coming from the White House, right, you get this idea that Ukraine is on the verge of collapse, and I did not feel that at all. I really, you know, the people I meet with, everyone is doing a professional job, but generally there is, I think, still a pretty good feeling about where Ukraine is going in terms of where the war is going to end.
Yeah, I also felt, finally enough, that all these events around Ukraine, the recent one, they just united us once again, just like it was in 2022 in the beginning. If I may ask you, what were you doing here?
I'm meeting different people.
Mm-hmm.
It's connected to a research project I'm doing at the Defense College, which is actually about the influence of social media on warfare. So it's very much actually media people I've been meeting and trying to figure out what new dynamics does it make? What does it mean for the military commanders that we have all the social media and all the soldiers also, you know, checking stuff on the smartphone and getting information these ways. And, you know, so it's actually those aspects that I have mostly been focused on.
Ukraine confirmed that the withdrawal from Kursk region. How do you assess this operation in general, and what does it say about Ukraine's battlefield strategy in general, in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, it's clear it was never the intention to keep this, right? So Ukraine did not go into the Kursk region to annex it and make it a part of Ukraine. So the fact that Ukraine is now withdrawing, it's not that surprising. I think when we look back at it, the goals were never clearly stated that this is exactly what we wanted to achieve. But I think we can sort of derive some things and say what were the goals here. And in some sense, it was a success, and in others, it probably wasn't. I think when it was initiated back in the summer, the plan was also to demonstrate to the Biden administration back at that time that it was pretty safe to equip Ukraine to take the war onto Russian territory, so that there was no need to be afraid of escalation and those things. So I think Ukraine was hoping for sort of a final push in the end of the Biden administration. I don't think it worked in that sense. But it clearly did something else. It gave a bunch of prisoners, for example, that allowed Ukraine to get some of the Mariupol defenders back out. It created a diversion that over time eased the pressure on others in other sectors of the front line. So in that respect, I think it worked. And overall, I think it's also just important to note that Russia is throwing everything they have at Ukraine. And, ultimately it's better for Ukraine if the bombs they throw are thrown on Russian cities than if they are on Ukrainian ones.
There's been news that Russia is not ready for this 30-day ceasefire because they believe Ukraine will take this time to regroup. It's exactly what we thought what Russia will do. Does it tell us that Russia maybe is weaker than everyone, and especially America thinks?
It's difficult. I don't know how fast you're going to get this this podcast out,
Yeah,
right?
a lot can change.
Because things change every day,
Yeah,
and
it's crazy.
But the bigger picture here is that there is a strange game going on right now, where the Americans insist on talking about ceasefire and peace, and really we have both Ukraine and Russia not really believing that this is a thing that's going to happen, right? So what's really going on is some kind of performative act where Ukraine and Russia are both pretending that they are, that this is real and that they believe in Donald Trump's plan, because they want, when this fails, they want Donald Trump to blame the other ones, right? So that's basically what's going on here, and I think now Ukraine made this deal with the Americans that we can suggest this 30-day ceasefire. Russia's probably not going to go along with that. I think they're going to try to play something back where they will try to force Ukraine into rejecting the new plan, and that kind of game is going back and forth right now. The conditions are just not there right now for actually ending the war. The military conditions are not there, I'm not very optimistic that in the end it's going to lead to anything.
By saying military conditions, what do you mean?
Frankly, what I mean is that neither side is close enough to losing. What the goals for each side are not compatible. So Russia wants some kind of arrangement where they get the ultimate control over Ukraine and the entirety of Ukraine into the future, where Ukraine will not be a truly sovereign, independent nation, right? And Ukraine wants a conclusion to the war where it is a sovereign, independent nation, and Russia will never, ever again be able to push their influence onto Ukraine, right? And these things are just not compatible. You can't be both sovereign and not sovereign, right? So for one of the sides to give in and say, okay, we actually give up on this, they would have to be very close to losing. And I don't think either side is close to losing at this point. It's still two very equal armies fighting this out on the front line.
Let's speak about Russia's weaknesses. Are they on logistical side, on personnel side? How do you see Ukraine using these weaknesses to actually to fight it?
Well, it's a war of attrition, and it's clear that the Russian army today is severely weakened by 3 years of fighting. That is also true for the Ukrainian one, but I think it's especially true for the Russian one. When we look at what they had in the beginning and then what they have now, it's just not at all comparable. And that's also worth keeping in mind when we have the Americans threatening to withdraw military help and what have you, that the Russian army that Ukraine faces today is not the same Russian army that was a year ago or 2 years ago. So it's a Russian army that they lack armored vehicles. They don't have the manpower that they need to push on, etc. So they could make decisions to mitigate some of these things. They still don't have general mobilization, but that would be politically risky in a Russian context. And there is a reason why Putin has not taken this step, right? It's because he's afraid of the consequences if he does that. And then on the logistics side, of course, there are all these memes with donkeys going around right now, right? This is the Russian army today, right? It's a Russian army that is attacking by foot and with donkeys. So, and then of course they are learning in the sense of, implementing drones and these things, but it's a Russian army that is not capable of big maneuver warfare. They just don't have the materiel that they had earlier in the war. And then it's a Russian sort of federation that is struggling with the economy. The way they are running the war economy is not sustainable in the long run. Mm-hmm. So I think in the big perspective, my message would be that we have seen the peak of Russian strength, and from here it's going to be a gradual decline. The challenge will be for Ukraine to avoid a similar decline, because in that case it's not going anywhere, right? But if Ukraine can maintain strength while the Russian sort of strength is declining, then that might open opportunities.
If you were to describe Russia's and Ukrainian strategies briefly, how would you describe it?
Well, the Russian strategy is very much about all the time pushing forward and thinking that over time, right, they thought it was going to be a quick war. It turned out not to be a quick war, but there is still a very high degree of confidence that they're going to win over time because they can just keep on pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing. So it might take a long time, but in the end, they're going to make it, right? And then I think the idea is that just basically keep on the pressure, and then eventually the West will stop supporting Ukraine because the West is going to get tired of this, and they're going to want a deal. So they look at what's happening right now with the Trump administration, and so eager to talk with them, right? And they see that as a sign that, well, our strategy is working, right? We keep on the pressure, and then now the Americans are buckling up, right? The Ukrainian strategy has been about, well, at least since the counteroffensive of 2023 that didn't really work, has been about maximizing Russian losses and saying that this is a war of attrition. It's about maximizing the casualties on their side. It's about trying to hit their defense economy. So that's what we've seen really with the long-range drone strikes and trying to hit the Russian economy where it hurts the most. And then about trying to secure a high sort of level of supplies and boosting the domestic defense industry so that Ukraine can maintain this over time. So it's a more patient, I would say, approach where the idea is that the Russians will not be able to keep up this pressure forever, and then if Ukraine can continue further than that, then that might change the direction.
Talking about this deep drone strikes by Ukraine, I mean, it surged dramatically over the last few months. Can we call this a next game changer?
I think we can call it a game changer in the sense that it is new, right? This is a capability that Ukraine didn't have before. I think if we look at where are the Russians now, right, then we can say that they don't really have all that much that they didn't have 2 years ago as well, right? I think when the war started, they didn't have the drones that they then got from Iran, right? But after about a year into the war, then they had more or less all the types of equipment that they're still using, and in some sense they actually had more because, as I said, they've lost many of the vehicles and stuff. Ukraine is in the other boat, you can say. Ukraine started with all these without all these. The drones, the long-range strike capabilities, and has been able to build those capabilities during the war. And now we see Ukraine really being able to launch these massive ranged attacks on Russian infrastructure. And there is no reason to believing really that this is a capability that's going to, decline again, right? It's only growing from here. So I think it's going to change using a word like a game changer is always a little risky, right? But it's going to change the game in the sense that it is introducing something that wasn't there before.
During these 3 years, Ukraine has been the biggest testing ground for technologies. So in your opinion, what worked well? What didn't work at all? What's your analysis?
I mean, it's obvious that things like the drones is absolutely new. I don't think anyone had seen that we would it would dominate so much. I think everyone could very quickly see that drones, there's something interesting here, but that we're now talking about millions of drones per year and all these different types of drones and the development into also unmanned ground vehicles is, all this is something that has worked fantastically well. Then there've also been things that probably didn't work quite as well as as one would have expected, but or just are losing some of its relevance, you can say. Earlier in the war, for example, artillery was really the weapon that made the difference on the front line. Today, we are approaching a point where artillery is kind of nice to have, but it's not the same thing just because it's being replaced by drones, right? So we are seeing, things that are developing trends.
Do you think that this is like the end of the era of the war that we knew it before?
Yeah, you could say what Ukraine is missing that, if this were just a testing ground, what would be really interesting would be to see what a strong conventional air force could do, right? Something like how would the front line look differently if you had the U.S. Air Force, for example, supporting you, right? Because that might, right now, drones are clear. That is the air power of the front line. But if there were F-35s and stuff, then that might change some of that, and drones might not play the same role. So I think it's difficult to say that this has necessarily changed all warfare forever, but it's clear that this is a new capability that is there, and it's going to create challenges in any war going forward that this exists, and also just the sheer cost of, it's so cheap. To get this, so that allows Ukraine to have these massive millions of drones, but it will also allow all kinds of other groups that in any fight going forward will just have air power, which is something they didn't have a few years ago.
In your interview with Silicon Curtain, you mentioned that Europe lacks basically drones and drone pilots. What is the solution to this? How do you see it changing?
I think we are at a place now where, there's still this interesting dynamic where Ukraine sends, mobilized soldiers to Europe to learn how to do warfare, but really,
even with drones, I heard it from Ukrainian pilots that they've been taught how to fly drones.
Clearly, it's the opposite way around by now, right? It's the European armies that need to learn from Ukraine, and we are behind. But it's also just really difficult when you are in this peacetime mode to keep up with the pace, right? The pace at which technology is being developed and then used, and then countermeasures are invented, and it's not. I don't think it's possible really for our armies to do that. So we have to find different ways of getting into this. But there's no doubt about it that just the getting started on the process of training drone pilots, just so you have a basic understanding of what does this mean on the battlefield. That is something that's, we really need to get going on. And also, I would say in the new security situation where there is uncertainty about American security guarantees for the European countries, then we might have to fight without the U.S. Air Force as well, right? So I think drones is going to be a part of the solution to that. And if nothing else, we need to work with the fact that the Russians now have this experience.
Many European countries, as well as Canada, they were kind of relying on the F-35 for procurement, and now many countries breaking up. For example, like Portugal, Canada also is thinking. So, is Europe able to live without American fighter jets? Does Europe produce enough of their own, and how does Europe maintain its air superiority, basically?
Well, it's clear that there is going to be a period where there will be a security vacuum, right? If the United States withdraws, and European defense production will have to be boosted. But on the other hand, I would say, there's the last couple of months, there's been a lot of confusion. What on earth is going on? What is it that Donald Trump wants, et cetera? But I think there's also some clarity, right? It's become clear that the future security order in Europe is not going to be based on American security guarantees. That's just not going to happen. And that means that the European countries will have to look to European production. And the biggest thing that will boost production is going to be investments, it's orders. And I think actually there is on the other side of this war, there's going to be a bright future also for Ukrainian defense production, right? Because you have, massive production capability right now, and you have all these European countries just screaming for we need capabilities and we need them yesterday.
Okay, but if, for example, NATO, I don't know, dissolves or weakens significantly, will there be some sort of alliance inside Europe? How viable will it be? What's your stance on that?
Yeah, I think that is, it will be necessary for the European countries to find some way of balancing Russia without the United States. And of course, that is possible. If we look at the economic potential of the European countries, then, there is no reason really why we couldn't do that. But I think the only way that Europe can do this is together with Ukraine. So in some sense, the fact that there is now this uncertainty about where America is actually means that the European countries are going to be more invested in Ukraine. So ironically, we have the American administration actually trying to push Ukraine into what looks like a really bad peace deal. Mm-hmm. But you also have the European countries that for whom that is no longer an option, right? There has to be a good solution for Ukraine, because if that is not the case, then we will not be able to balance against Russia. But of course it's possible, right? We look at where is Russia today, and Ukraine has more or less managed to hold the Russians back, right? They are struggling right now to take cities like Chasiv Yar or Toretsk, right? And so the Russians are not 12 feet tall, or, they can be managed, right? But it is definitely a challenge. And it's something the European countries will need to step up very quickly.
It looks like political leadership, also military leadership of Europe is switching to understanding that security needs to be 45, peace through strength, all of that. But how are people feeling? Because you mentioned this peaceful way of life, but so how do people understand what can be possibly happening in the future?
That is my impression, at least where I come from in Denmark.
Yeah.
I mean, it is my impression that people get this. There is a real sense of urgency about it. But of course, you can say a country like Denmark is just a small player in this, right? What we really need is that sense of urgency in a country like Germany, for example. Mm-hmm. But it seems the new German government is determined here. It seems the French are determined here. Mm-hmm. The Polish definitely are. Obviously, Ukraine is very determined. So I do see some of the big, strong players here showing a lot of determination to do something and also do it quickly. So in general, I'm pretty optimistic in that sense that something will happen now.
Just even a month ago, there was a strong belief that Russia will inevitably go to Baltics if Ukraine falls. Do you still believe so? What if Ukraine falls? What's going to happen next?
I think you're right. I think that is going to happen. But I think Ukraine. This is now we're getting into guesswork. Which is the next country that Russia is going to invade? My personal take on this will be that they're probably the next, if there is some kind of ceasefire, sort of bad peace deal here, I think the next country is also going to be Ukraine. That will be I think that Ukraine to Russia is the most important one to take. And then once that happens, then, maybe the Baltic countries, maybe something in Finland, but that would be my biggest fear right now, that if there is if the fighting stops, the reason why it's possible for Ukraine right now to hold the Russians back is that you have this Russian army that is suffering after more than 3 years of attrition, right? But if they get, say, 6 months where they can rebuild their forces, then they might be able to start a new push, and it's not guaranteed that Ukraine would be able to hold them back. So I think actually there is real danger there in pausing the war without some kind of final solution with rock solid security guarantees for Ukraine.
In your opinion, what are these rock solid security guarantees? Because there are so many, peacekeepers. In my own opinion, I'm not so sure about that. If they're just there to watch, So
Yeah.
what are the real security guarantees that will prevent Russia from attacking again?
Yeah, I mean it's a new kind of alliance that includes like a real. So we're not talking about neutral peacekeepers that will be sort of standing there between the Ukrainian and the Russian armies and looking, just observing what happens, right? That's not what we're talking about. We would need different forces in Ukraine that are willing to fight with Ukraine if that happens again. And in a slightly longer perspective, we will have to find some kind of nuclear umbrella that will cover also Ukraine. This is a problem that all the European countries are having right now, right? That our nuclear umbrella was the United States, and that seems to be disappearing. So we have to find some kind of new nuclear structure in Europe where, one way or another, there has to be this dimension, and that will also have to include Ukraine.
Do you believe in? There was also some discussions about Ukraine getting its nuclear status back. Do you think it's possible at all?
I mean, there is a political problem, right, in the non-proliferation treaty, and nobody really wants to be the one to break that. But aside from that, there is no reason why the European countries, there is no technical reason why countries like Ukraine or Poland or Germany or Finland could build nuclear weapons. Of course, they can build them. Ukraine has all the missile technology, for example. So it's just about building the warhead. I think there's going to be a lot of work to see if we can find a way to do this that won't directly break the non-proliferation treaty, because that might start sort of a chain reaction where a bunch of countries across the globe want nuclear weapons, right? So if there is some way to do it based on the French and the British nuclear arsenals that are sort of, shared or something, I think, the politicians will prefer that. But if that does not work out, I think we should expect some European countries to take that step. And once one country does it, then other countries will follow.
Some people believe that Russia is already waging hybrid warfare in Europe. How do you see Europe fighting it? Is it fighting it? Because, we've been, I had another guest, and we've been joking that there's reports on reports on reports, but no action. So how can Europe defend itself against hybrid warfare?
Yeah, that's interesting. Actually, the Western strategy throughout this whole invasion of Ukraine has been to just ignore hybrid warfare. And that's because the point of Russia's hybrid warfare is actually not, destroying this or that cable or whatever they do, like burning a warehouse or something. The point is to create fear and ultimately to, create, this sentiment in the Western populations that we should stop helping Ukraine here because we need to defend ourselves, or we should not provoke Russia, or those things, right? So the reaction has basically been just to ignore it, right? So just, that's unfortunate, right? But to interpret everything as an accident, because then you avoid that information, effect of creating fear. So that's, it's been interesting to watch, but the West and the NATO countries have been very determined to just ignore everything. And I don't know if that's possible to continue doing that, but I don't think it's necessarily been a bad idea to just, say, basically send the message to the Russians that if you want our attention, you're going to have to do something more than that. I mean, we're not going to be disturbed. If you want to pretend something hybrid here is going on, that's not enough to get our attention.
Isn't the price too high for this for this game?
I think it's going to end eventually with the Russians pushing it so hard that it's not possible to just ignore it. So far, it's been working sort of okay. I mean, the idea has been that what we want, our response to Russian hybrid warfare is to keep on helping Ukraine, right? That's been sort of the plan. about it. Has it been the right approach? I don't know. It's also possible that it has led some people to thinking that it's not so serious, or I don't know, maybe it hasn't created that sense of urgency. But I think that has been the plan, basically. And in some cases, it's kind of it's comical, right? You see all these things about anchor dragging in the Baltic Sea, for example, all these ships suddenly dragging their anchors and cutting our cables and stuff like that. And I don't know, the governments just keep on saying, "Oh, that's an unfortunate accident." Like that's another one, right? Right. It's been interesting to watch, but I think that has been the strategy. I don't think. Interestingly, I would say that all this hybrid warfare, it is Russia's attempt at bringing the war home to the Europeans, right? They don't want us to forget that there is a war going on, and the closer Russia gets to losing the war, the more intense it's going to be, the more willing to take risks they're going to be. So ironically, the closer Ukraine gets to winning the war, the higher the risk of hybrid warfare is going to be in Europe, and the more spectacular it will be.
I wanted your opinions about the Ukrainian naval strategy. I mean, we kicked it off quite well with naval drones. So how do you assess our maritime efforts in general?
In general, very well. I mean, in naval warfare, you can basically say there are two different kinds of approaches. You can have a strategy of getting sea control, where you go in, you dominate an area so you can use the sea for what you want. Or you can have an approach that is called sea denial, where what you want to do is to just, spoil it for the other side. Ukraine has applied a very good sea denial strategy. So Ukraine doesn't really have a navy. It's not Ukraine's ambition to go out and dominate the Black Sea, right? So you have developed these capabilities to prevent the Russians from doing that, because they do have a sea control strategy and they are not able to do that, right? They have lost that capability. So we don't see Russian Navy ships, for example, in between, say, Odessa and Crimea, helping with air defense or something like that. That might be something they would like to do, but they can't do that because of Ukraine's capabilities today. So I think Ukraine has really managed well in the maritime space. And I think basically the maritime war is more or less has reached its end state, right? There is this, things might still happen. There might still be some ships that sink, right? But in general, it has come to a point where there is mutual sea denial, and the Russians cannot use the sea as they want to anymore. And Ukraine has actually been able to open the civilian traffic, the merchant traffic to the big ports again.
Also, there was some opinions that Ukraine needs to be armed with heavy navy vessels, I guess, like submarines. Do we need that, or we are good enough with our drone army, drone fleet?
Yeah, I think for the moment, I don't think really there is the possibility of building a Ukrainian navy. Post-war, yes, but at the moment, that's not really. I don't think it would be a good use of resources, mostly because, as I said, Ukraine has sea denial. Ukraine can prevent Russia from using the sea, but Russia actually also can do that, right? So if Ukraine starts building these capabilities right now, it would just be attacked. So I don't think it's a good way of using that. But going forward, definitely, especially like mine warfare and those things would be necessary.
Do you see a potential in Ukraine, post-war Ukraine, to become a strong navy country? Because we have a difficult relationship with Navy. We were never.
No.
So can it possibly change?
No, I mean, obviously you have a tradition of shipbuilding, right? I think
but it kind of suffered a little bit.
Yeah, it suffered a little bit, right? But to be honest, I think the biggest challenge is the Air Force. I think that would be a more valuable investment. And what Ukraine is really lacking right now. It would not be outrageous for a country the size of Ukraine to have 300 or 400 modern fighter jets, for example. Building a force like that would really make a difference. So I think my guess is that would be a more likely sort of place to put the investments going forward.
Denmark helped us greatly. Why? Why are you so compassionate? And could you explain that?
About helping Ukraine, I think, it's one of those things that makes me proud. I think we have a government that actually gets this, that actually understands what the war is about and what's at stake. So that's why we've seen Denmark really trying to take the lead in, making some of these, showing the way, making some of these decisions in the hope of getting others to follow. So we saw that with the fighter jets. We've seen that with the Danish model, for example, that people are talking a lot about here, about procurement, where Danish money is used that goes directly into the Ukrainian defense industry, just because that is where we get most value for money. But where others have been sort of cautious earlier. So I think we see Denmark trying to take the lead, and even though we are a small country we don't have that many resources, we can set an example and then be an inspiration for others.
In your opinion, which countries followed your example greatly, and who still need some time to adapt?
No, I think we really are seeing some big shifts right now, especially following all the turbulence that happened in February. We are seeing many big European countries now making the right steps, but it will be very important to get Germany on board with this. Germany has been very good at providing quantities of stuff, but has been too cautious about certain types of equipment.
Like Taurus?
Yeah, for example, like the Taurus missiles, about these things that will equip Ukraine to actually, not just keep defending, but actually making progress and deciding the war. I think we're seeing countries like France also now stepping up, and but I still think when we look at it in the big picture, it's a little and it's actually all the big countries in Europe that I think have underperformed in terms of commitment. If you look at money per capita, right, and even some like the British, for example, have been very good at sounding very supportive of Ukraine and have been making some important steps in providing some of those cutting-edge technology things. But if you look at the quantity of what's been provided, it's also not been nearly what we've seen from, for example, countries like Denmark or the Baltic countries. So I think it's all the big European countries that need to step up now.
Do you think it didn't happen from the beginning because of the denial of not willingness to realize that it's an existential war for Ukraine, or why?
Yeah, and then I think the European countries were happy to let the Americans take leadership because that's basically been what we've been doing for 80 years, right? So that's the habit, and the Americans had most resources, and the Biden administration actually also, at least in the beginning, appeared to have like a plan, and they understood what was going on and kept making these warnings about, well, Russia's going to attack, right? So European countries were happy to let the Americans sort of run this. And then over time, it became clear that the Biden administration was very concerned about escalation and did not actually, want to really provide Ukraine with what it took to seriously put Russia under pressure. So it was a balancing act that basically was about just making sure that Ukraine could sort of hold the line, but also not more than that. And I think that's how we ended up in this, where it was American leadership that brought us here, and it was European countries that were happy to let the Americans do this.
So basically, you would agree if with the statement that if we got all we asked for in the beginning, plus the sanctions, the war would be over in favor of Ukraine, obviously.
Yes, I would agree with that. I actually think that if very rock solid support had been given very, very early in the war, I think there's a high likelihood that Putin would have found a way out within the first couple of months, just some way to declare victory. But he didn't do that, right? And he doubled down. And then once we got, past the point where they made the annexation of these 4 regions, then, it was really hard to see a way back. If Ukraine had been equipped more at an earlier time, sure. I mean, there was momentum in the fall of 2022 for Ukraine. And the counteroffensive of 2023 was, when we look at it, it was just ridiculous, really, how Ukraine was not equipped to do that, but was still being pushed into trying, right, by the Western countries. But there was at that point a clear, a sense that the Russian army was much weaker than it actually was, based on what we'd seen in the early months, and But I think it's really unfortunate that Ukraine has not been helped more, because I think it could have ended the war, and I also think it would have ended the war in a more safe way. I still think, this thing about saying we don't want to push the Russians because we're afraid of escalation. I think the risk of escalation has grown significantly because the war has taken longer. And the risk of some kind of political collapse in Russia that can be dangerous is also growing as the war progresses.
Do you think Ukraine will make it without the help of the United States of America?
Yeah, I don't see that Ukraine is close to collapsing. I don't see a Russian army that is able to progress. Particularly, the most important weapons on the front line today are drones and mines. These are things that are domestically produced in Ukraine. With European investments, that is it's absolutely possible to keep fighting. There will be, if Ukraine is to fight entirely without American technology, there will be certain types of equipment, like Patriot missiles, for example, that will be really hard to miss, right? But it will not be decisive for the war, but it will prolong the war if Ukraine loses those resources and will have to spend time finding them somewhere else. But as I said, I mean, there's no reason why Europe cannot support Ukraine to victory. That is absolutely possible. There is the financial strength to do that, and it's also become imperative for Europe that happens. Right? It's not an option for Europe that Ukraine falls, and that the Ukrainian population and the Ukrainian defense industry all falls in Russian hands. That's just not an acceptable outcome. So in that sense, I'm long-term quite optimistic, but unfortunately, I think the war has been prolonged.
You mentioned the term victory and the peace. So are these two different terms in your mind, or peace equals victory? Because, in the beginning of war, you were saying that the victory of Ukraine is when Russia is disintegrated. I mean, something changed. So how does it look to you now?
Yeah. I mean, I'm probably not one of those who thinks that Russia is about to disintegrate. I don't really see that happening. I do see a potential for Russia changing its attitude from, there have been other nations in Europe that used to be empires that kind of changed its mind. We wouldn't have to go all that far back to have a British Empire, a French Empire, the German Empire. How did they change their mind? Well, they changed their attitude because they started losing wars, right? And I think the same thing could happen where Russia, has some kind of transformative process where they start seeing themselves not as an empire but as a nation state. So that of course would be a good outcome, right? But I think that would require a significant defeat for Russia, something that would really be so painful that it transformed the Russian national identity. And I'm not sure this war is going to lead to that. It might, but it might not. I will also say, what is victory? Does victory mean getting all back to the 1991 borders? I think something like that would require a kind of collapse on the Russian side. That is not impossible. Armies sometimes do collapse. They fight until one day they don't, right? It might happen, but it's perhaps not the most likely thing that suddenly one day the Russian, the whole thing just disintegrates and they all go home. Right. That's how you can say World War I ended for the Russians, but But I think it's important that in Ukraine there has to be some kind of discussion about this as well. That there might be different outcomes here, and we might be able to get all the territory, but there might also come a point when it's up to you to decide how long do you want to keep on fighting for this, right? And maybe it's not possible.
Yeah, I don't know if we have any other options to keep fighting because as I said, and you understand, and many people understand, that is existential. If we stop fighting, then we will be attacked again. So
if you stop fighting and we just and there is no new security arrangements, you don't have the security guarantees, you don't have a part of a new European alliance with, then absolutely that's not an option. Russia will attack again. That's because the goal is still the same. What Russia wants is to subjugate all of Ukraine. Right? It's about having a pro-Russian government in Kyiv. That is the goal, and they are going to push on for that until they are forced not to.
Thank you very much for this talk. I really enjoyed it. It was very informative, and good luck with everything that you're doing. And thanks again for being here. It's great to have you on Ukraine's side.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks.